Greetings. Father Mark signing on from St. Louis, King of France Parish in Bucktown, Louisiana on the 24th day of June, 2020. This is the third part in a series on the church and priestly ministry in times of crisis, prepared for the summer program at Notre Dame Seminary. This video can be understood on its own, if you wish, or if you want to watch the previous two installments. They're on this channel under the Church History playlist. Part 1 is titled Yellow Fever, 1793, and the second, Part 2, is titled Yellow Fever, 1853. And of course, if you can watch this just as a church history video, even if you're not a seminarian. But if you are one of my students in the seminary, this material will be on your final exam as usual. And Part 3 will be an essay question. If you choose not to watch the previous two videos, the essential background can be summarized as follows. Part 1 covered a yellow fever outbreak in Philadelphia, which claimed the lives of 5,000 out of a population of 50,000. Part 2 dealt with an outbreak of the same disease in New Orleans, which claimed 8,000 lives out of a population of 119,000. And that one in 1853 was the worst yellow fever death toll in a single city in a single year. Yellow fever is transmitted to humans through the bite of one mosquito species, Aedes aegypti. The female does this in order to suction blood, from which she extracts protein to grow her eggs. She lays up to 200 eggs in pools of stagnant water. Even today, there is no cure, but there is a vaccine that was not available in the time covered in this video. Here, in Part 3, we will deal with the 1867 outbreak of the disease, which was more serious regionally than the previous episodes we covered. It claimed 20,000 lives in one summer, but it did not have the death toll in any single city that the New Orleans 1853 outbreak had. Now, there was a total death toll in the region in the South was 20,000, but no single city had more than 8,000 die, as happened in New Orleans in 1853. The reason I'm concluding with this 1867 outbreak is that one of the victims in New Orleans was a Redemptorist priest, now beatified on his way to sainthood. As part of the cause. He was, but he's beatified now. Blessed Francis Xavier Seelos. By way of preparation, in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 28, the risen Jesus manifested to the 11 apostles remaining after the suicide of Judas, but before they selected Matthias as his replacement. Jesus issued this command to them, beginning in verse 19. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. This attitude of mission on a global scale inspired Blessed Seelos and his confrere, whom we'll also meet, and his spiritual father, Saint John Newman, inspired both of them to seek ecclesiastical vocations and then to commit to a specialized religious ministry of foreign service, both of them in the Congregation of the Most Holy Redeemer, which they served far away from their earthly home. In the last video, we saw that the city of New Orleans was established as a colony of France in the year 1718. The Congregation of the Most Holy Redeemer, which they joined, the Redemptorists, better known as the Redemptorists, was established 14 years later, on November 9th, 1732, by an Italian Saint Alphonsus Liguori. 17 years after that, in 1749, Pope Benedict XIV granted papal recognition to the Redemptorists so that they could spread outside of their home diocese. And today, the Redemptorists serve in over 100 countries. The Redemptorists are a missionary society directed to reviving parish life. Their regula demands that they, quote, strive to imitate the virtues and examples of Jesus Christ, our Redeemer, consecrating themselves especially to the preaching of the Word of God to the poor. The Redemptorists take the vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, which members of all religious orders take. For the Redemptorists, the vow of poverty bound them to refuse all ecclesiastical dignities outside of the congregation, meaning positions as Monsignor, Bishop, Archbishop, Cardinal. However, as we shall see, in American history, the Holy See, owing to the needs of the expanding church for bishops in the 19th century, at times dispensed this requirement. So that we do have Redemptorist bishops, and St. John Newman was one of them. To these vows, the Redemptorists add an oath of perseverance to live in the congregation until death, rather than exclaustrate to become diocesan clergy or to join another religious community. Their methodology consisted of parish missions and retreats, which we'll summarize later in this talk, and at times included their assuming ordinary care of parishes, in which case they historically promoted parochial schools. Blessed Seelos, well, he wasn't obviously blessed at the time, but Francis Seelos came to know the Redemptorists in his home country of Bavaria, Germany. He spent the balance of his adult life working for them in the United States. The United States came into being 27 years after the Redemptorists did, by declaring its independence in 1776 and successfully fighting a war of liberation until Great Britain recognized the fact of American independence in 1783. 10 years later, in 1793, the yellow fever struck the nation's first capital, Philadelphia, which we covered in the first video of this series. Seelos was born 26 years later. To configure him culturally and historically, we travel first to the Alpine mountains of Europe to find Lake Formarinsee, located in present Vorarlberg, Austria. From this lake, a high alpine lake, gravity drains water from this lake through a karst fenster. So there are different ways that water from mountain lakes becomes rivers. Some just overflow the bank and go down, as happens with the Mississippi. But that's not the case here. Another way, and it depends on the composition of the topography. So this part of the Alpine Mountains is composed largely of limestone and dolomite, which erodes. So a karst fenster is essentially a hole at the bottom of the lake that has eroded, and the water drains through that and forms a river. And at times, because of that, of the mineral composition, sometimes the river is above the ground, at other times it goes back below the ground. In this case, the one that's significant for us, the karst fenster, is significant for us, what drains through it, forms the 158-mile-long River Lech. At the point where the River Lech egresses the Alps and goes down, it is at elevation 2,580 feet. It spills down onto a plain. The strategic significance of that geographic feature was recognized by the ancient Romans when they were building their empire. So they established a base right there. It was it was at a gorge through the Alpine Mountains. The Latin word for a gorge is fauces. So that's what they named the settlement, Faucia. The Romans then terraformed a connection of their settlement to the Via Claudia Augusta, one of the famous Roman roads. It stretched north to Vindelicum and south to the Po River. So Vindelicum is now Augsburg in Germany, and the Po River, of course, is in Italy. So it was an essential north-south artery in the empire. This was the imperial province of Raetia. It was the base of the 3rd Legion, guarding that essential Alpine pass. In the 5th century AD, when the Roman Empire and the West collapsed, a Germanic tribe, calling itself the Bajuvari, occupied the area of the gorge. Evidently, some old imperials remained, and probably intermarried with the Bajuvari, as the Roman name for the gorge was retained in the new language. So the town remained, and it became the town of Fussen in German. The Bajuvari also endured as Bavarians, creating a distinct culture that still characterizes southern Germany. Blessed Seelos was born one of them, a Bavarian. He was born in that town, Fussen, on the 11th of January, 1819. He was one of 12 children, coincidentally, named in honor of a missionary, a great Jesuit missionary, Francis Xavier Seelos. His father, Magnus, was a tailor by profession, and he was a volunteer sacristan at the local parish church, the Church of St. Mang. Seelos was baptized in that church on the day of his birth. His mother, Franziska, was a devout Catholic. At the time Seelos was born, in the year 1819, Germany was not politically united as a single country. That took place in 1871, 4 years after Seelos died. When Seelos was born in Fussen, he was a citizen of the Kingdom of Bavaria in southern Germany, ruled by the House of Wittelsbach from 1805, 14 years before Seelos was born, until the end of the First World War in the 20th century. From 1820, the year after Seelos's birth, until the First World War in the 20th century. So in that, it's 100 years basically. So in that century, many indigenous Germans left Germany. Of those who left, 7.3 million emigrated to the United States, seeking opportunity that was not available in the many small and often tyrannical principalities of 19th century Europe. These 7.3 million Germans grew to the current German-American population of 48 million in the United States. Many of these Germans were of the Catholic faith, especially those from southern Germany, Bavaria, and Swabia, as well as those from Alsace-Lorraine, which is a territory along the Rhine that shifted hands between France and Germany many times over the last 800 years. The waves of flight from Europe overwhelmed the personnel and resources of bishops in the 18th and 19th century United States, leading to developments that shaped Seelos's adult life. Meanwhile, infant mortality was high in the early 19th century. 3 of Seelos's siblings died in infancy. Seelos himself was ill and often bedridden for the first decade of his life. When he was bedridden, his mother comforted him by reading to him from the lives of the saints. and noted that even in childhood, he endured hardships patiently. Seelos' sister Antonia wrote, quote, "He was always so amiable and tranquil that we loved him most of all." On the 3rd of January, 1825, when he was healthy enough, Seelos was enrolled in the local Volksschule. That's an elementary school, the primary school. It was a one-room schoolhouse for boys, and they nicknamed it the Corn House because it was before essentially it was a barn where they had been a market where they sold corn. Along with the standard elementary studies in a Catholic kingdom like Bavaria, they study religion, reading, writing, arithmetic. He was also taught hymns and folk songs in school. From childhood, he enthusiastically embraced music. He loved to sing, and he learned to play the violin. Seelos received the Sacrament of Confirmation on September 3rd, 1828, 4 months before his 10th birthday. He received this from the Bishop of Augsburg, the Most Reverend Albrecht von Rieg. Owing to the sequence in which the sacraments were offered at that time, that was before the reforms of Pope Pius X in the early 20th century, Seelos received First Communion 2 years later, 2 years after confirmation, on April 12, 1830. His sister Antonia recalled that after he received First Communion, Seelos started to play priest with friends and around an improvised altar. And he also volunteered as an altar boy at St. Mong Parish. Seelos completed elementary school, receiving a diploma on April 11th, 1831, 3 months before his 12th birthday. He received highest grades in religion, reading, and conduct. Meanwhile, during these formative years for Seelos, events were proceeding in both Europe and the United States that opened the path for his adult ecclesiastical life. In 1828, 9 years after Seelos was born, Monsignor Frederick Reze, then serving as Vicar General in the Diocese of Cincinnati, Ohio. Later, he served as the founding bishop of Detroit, Michigan, but at this point he was still in Cincinnati. He visited Europe in search of priests. While in Vienna, he recruited 3 Redemptorists, he recruited 6 Redemptorists. 3 of them were priests, 3 of them were lay brothers. He recruited them to come to Cincinnati, to Ohio. Through them, the Redemptorist order entered the United States for the first time. These 6 guys arrived in New York on June 20th, 1832, initiating their apostolate. They worked in Ohio and Michigan. In the same year that the Redemptorists moved to America, in October of 1832, Seelos moved away from home for the first time to attend, they called it the Gymnasium in Germany. It was the specific one he attended was the Institute of St. Stephen's. Now, in the European system at the time, Gymnasium in Germany corresponded to what we would think of as both high school and junior college. So it was a 6 or 7 year program. And in his case, it turned out to be 7 years. For 7 years, he studied classics. That's what you did at Gymnasium. They did this at the Institute. The St. Stephen Institute was maintained by the Benedictines. It was at an abbey, St. Stephen Abbey, in Augsburg, 66.9 miles up the Lech River from Füssen. His sister Antonia recorded that Seelos was very popular there at the Gymnasium. He was an enthusiastic musician, and he was the type. He was the one. You know, there are always these different types of this. You know, in some cases they're caricatures, but there are always these different like stock characters that are in high school. But he was the one that always reached out to the misfit kids, who were lonely. And this was a boarding school, which again was this characteristic of that, so all of the kids were away from home for the first time. So in gymnasium, they studied Latin, Greek, as well as continued studying German, the basics of German literature. And in some, they also taught Hebrew. On April 8th, 1839, the final year of Seelos's classical studies, the American Redemptorist Superior, Father Joseph Prost, opened St. Philomena Church in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, to serve German immigrants. This later turned out to be Seelos's first assignment as a priest. At the time, Pittsburgh was part of the Diocese of Philadelphia, which we visited in the first talk. So Father Prost obtained permission from the Bishop of Philadelphia, who at the time was the Most Reverend Henry Conwell. The following month, on May 26, 1839, Pope Gregory XVI canonized St. Alphonsus Liguori as a saint, giving added notoriety to the Redemptorist order he founded and to its mission. 3 months later, on August 26th, Seelos graduated from St. Stephen's, ranked 9th out of 69, which sufficed for a recommendation to attend university. On November 5th, 1839, he commenced his studies at the Ludwig Maximilian University, which is the university in Munich, the capital of Bavaria. That was 49.2 miles east of Augsburg on the Isar River. There he studied philosophy, and he continued his personal enthusiasm for music. This was commented on by an Anton Scherzner, who was a fellow student and friend. He commented that Seelos loved to sing during Mass. He sang very loudly, but he liked music. While he was in university, he made a pilgrimage. Seelos made a pilgrimage 57.7 miles east to the Gnadenkapelle, the Chapel of Grace, in Altötting, which is the reason he did it, is it was the site of a miraculous healing that took place in 1489, attributed to Our Lady. And this is still a famous pilgrimage site. Pope John Paul II made a pilgrimage there in 1980, and Pope Benedict XVI made a pilgrimage there in 2006. During his first year of study at university, his freshman year at University of Munich, on July 26, 1840, Redemptorists assumed care for the German-speaking Catholics in the American city of Baltimore, Maryland. This was St. John the Evangelist Parish and St. James the Less Parish. This is where, in this church, St. James, is where Seelos would be ordained a priest and would celebrate his first Mass. The Redemptorist success in parish work fostered their rapid expansion in the United States. After Baltimore in 1840, they were invited, these bishops inviting them, to come help, in Rochester, 1841, New York City, 1842, Philadelphia in 43, Buffalo, New York in 45, Detroit and New Orleans in 1847, and to Cumberland, Maryland in 49. Seelos would spend time at many of these foundations as a priest, the last being in New Orleans, and that's where he died, and so that'll be detailed later in the talk. Meanwhile, Seelos entered Major Seminary that's theology, on September 5th, 1842, 74.9 miles northwest of Munich, in Dillingen. That's in Swabia, the province of Swabia, but then that was part of the Kingdom of Bavaria. During his first year of theology in seminary, he applied for admission to the Redemptorist to serve in the American missions. Seelos was accepted as a novice in the Redemptorist order by Father Alexander Zvitkovic. He was Croatian, actually. He was the Redemptorist American superior, but emigrated to the United States. He accepted Seelos as a novice on November 22nd, 1842. Coincidentally, for a music lover, the feast of St. Cecilia, who's the patroness of music and musicians. Seelos wrote a letter home to his sister Antonia, dated December 9th, 1842, quote, "Love has united us. Love does not mean parting. Love will always remain. Love will unite us again in the beyond." Essentially a goodbye letter, because most of the people in the 19th century who left to come to the United States, they never went back home. Because of the cost and the time, they just couldn't take off that much time to come back home before airplanes. He sailed for America from Le Havre, the port of Le Havre, France, on March 17th, 1843, aboard a ship named the St. Nicholas. He arrived in New York 5 weeks later. That was a pretty standard length of time for crossing at that period. He landed in New York on April 20th, 1843. That happened to be Easter Thursday that year. Seelos began his novitiate in the aforementioned St. James the Less Church in Baltimore on May 16th, 1843. The novitiate is a year long, so 1 year later on May 16th, 1844, Seelos professed his vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience as a Redemptorist. 7 months later, he was ordained a priest on December 22nd, 1844, in the same church, St. James the Less in Baltimore. He was ordained by the Archbishop of Baltimore, Samuel Eccleston. He offered his first Mass on Christmas Day in the same church. He wrote back home that he remembered his family in his first Mass. Seelos wrote, quote, "I certainly did include all of you in them," meaning his prayers, "and recommended you to him," God, capitalized him, God, "whom I had so closely before me and touched with my own hands," meaning Jesus and the Blessed Sacrament. On January 12th, 1845, Seelos performed his first baptism. On March 29th of the same year, he heard his first confessions. Initially, he was conversant in German and French, but he had to learn English as an adult here in the United States. In August of 1845, Seelos received his first priestly assignment to the aforementioned St. Philomena Parish in Pittsburgh. He was, then they called him assistant pastors. They don't do that anymore. Now, today he'd be called a parochial vicar. His first pastor, and the way, in these religious communities, often when they have a parish, at some of the parishes, they'll also have their base, their priory. And that was the case here. St. Philomena had a house for the Redemptorist, so they had a pastor for the parish, and then they had their religious community. And, sometimes the head of the community was a different person, because they might have more Redemptorists living there than were actually working in the parish. But in this case, when Seelos was there at St. Philomena, it happened to be the same person. The pastor of St. Philomena was also the superior of the community. And it happened to be none other than the guy who, since 1977, is St. John Newman. He was another immigrant, like Seelos, a Redemptorist priest. Seelos wrote of him, quote, "He loved me as his own son. Above all, the example of his virtuous life is always before my eyes. His constant modesty, his great humility, and his all-conquering long-suffering." So who was this guy? St. John Newman, so far, is not only the only United States bishop to be a saint, he is the only male U.S. citizen to be a canonized saint. So, St. John Newman, he was born in what was then the Austrian Empire, but he was not Austrian. He was born in Bohemia, which is now the Czech Republic. His father, Johann Philippe, was a stocking knitter, also made blankets. His mother, Agnes, assisted in it was essentially a home, just a home business that they worked in together. Early discerning a call to ecclesiastical life, John Newman entered seminary in 1831. Then, in 1833, he enrolled in the Charles University, it's the University of Prague. By the time he was done, he was conversant in 6 languages and had a working knowledge of botany. In 1835, he was ready for ordination as his theology studies were complete, for which he applied to the Archbishop of Prague. But the Archbishop, who was Andres Ankovic, told him that he had too many priests. You imagine that problem? The Archbishop said he had more priests than parishes, and that even though you could assign more than one priest to a parish, obviously, but he said that he knew that of all the rectories, that all the bedrooms and all the rectories were full. So he had more priests than he needed. So I told him, just wait a few years and then come back. Essentially wait for some priest to die, and then you'd ordain him. But so John waited. He waited for a year, only a year. Then he went back, and the Archbishop told him the same thing. And he said, but the Archbishop was understanding, so he wrote him a nice letter of recommendation, and Newman obtained his permission to come to the United States. Newman landed in New York in 1836 with one bag, wearing one suit, and having $1 in his pocket. But he also had a letter of recommendation from his Archbishop. With this, Newman applied for an interview with the Bishop of New York, another immigrant, this one from France, Jean Dubois. He certainly did not have an overabundance of priests, considering all the immigrants coming into New York at the time, and so many of them were Catholic. So he ordained Newman for the Diocese of New York on June 25th, 1836, in the old St. Patrick Cathedral in New York City. At the time, the Diocese of New York encompassed not only the entirety of New York State, but also half of the state of New Jersey. Newman was assigned to work near the Canadian border, riding the horseback circuit in the Niagara Falls region, and from Lake Ontario to the border of Pennsylvania. It was estimated that this area contained 200,000 Catholics. After 4 years of this ministry, the horseback ministry, which is very characteristic of priesthood and Catholic priesthood in the 19th century United States, after 4 years of this, Newman was spiritually drained. So he requested and received from Bishop Dubois permission to join the Redemptorists in 1840. After novitiate, he professed vows in Baltimore on January 16, 1842. In keeping with the ministry of his order, Newman continued traveling. I mean, he didn't get out of the horseback ministry, because that's just the way priesthood was done then. But through the network of Redemptorist parishes, wherever, he would go from one Redemptorist base to another. So he was going from community to community, not just going on horseback, sleeping in a tent, then going to find some cabin somewhere to offer baptism and mass, and then going to so it was it wasn't the horseback thing that he objected to as much as it was the isolation. Anyway, in Pittsburgh, Newman's story intersects with that of Seelos, as Newman was both pastor of St. Philomena Parish as well as superior of the community, and for Seelos' first assignment. So as we said, Seelos arrived already fluent in French and German, but he worked hard to learn English, and he learned it in his first assignment in order to interact not only with the Anglo population, but more specifically with the Irish immigrants who spoke only English, and they were Catholic. And in addition, as all priests in their first assignment, he had to prepare classes to teach religion, prepare homilies for masses, familiarize himself with all the families, German and Irish immigrant families in his parish, apply himself to the ministry, and just get used to the United States, the way things were done here. With St. John Neumann as his mentor, Seelos completed his first assignment, fluent in English, and a sought-after confessor and spiritual director in 3 languages. In 1846, as part of his sort of apprenticeship, well, not really, but Neumann introduced Seelos to mission preaching. This is the Redemptorist charism. He was not in charge at this time. He was just assigned to be part of a Redemptorist mission group visiting St. Vincent's Church in Youngstown, Pennsylvania. The following year, September of 47, Seelos was appointed novice master of the St. Philomena community while remaining assigned to the parish, even though he was only 28 years old and just 3 years after taking vows himself. Part of it was his own quality, but also part of it was just the function of the rapid growth in the country at the time. 3 years later, in 1849, Neumann was transferred from Pennsylvania to Maryland. Neumann became pastor of St. Augustine Church in Elk Ridge, Maryland. The following year, 1850, the Redemptorists they were doing well. They'd been accepted in the United States and multiple places. So in 1850, the Redemptorist headquarters in Europe decided to create an American province of the order. The first provincial was another German immigrant, Reverend Bernhard Harkenscheid. He was a fellow student of the guy who would later become Pope Leo XIII. His priority was establishing a seminary and location for a novitiate. He chose Cumberland, Maryland for the seminary and Baltimore for the novitiate. 1 year later, the continued success of their missions to individual parishes prompted the Redemptorists in Europe to send 12 experienced preachers from Europe to initiate the order's first multi-state parish circuit mission. It commenced on April 1st, 1851, at St. Joseph's Church in New York. In the course of it, they heard 6,000 confessions. They gave First Communion to 60 adults and 400 children. At this period, the Redemptorist Parish missions were well advertised in advance, scheduled to last for anywhere between 1 week and 1 month. The Redemptorists generally assigned a team for these missions, with one identified as superior. Their internal constitutions required that their missions consist of the Redemptorist hearing confessions, sermon on prayer, specific sermons directed on prayer, specific sermon on intercession to the Blessed Mother, the theology and the spirituality of that, and on devotion to the Holy Family. Apart from that, missions were adaptable to the particular circumstances of the parish. The same year, 1851, Seelos was appointed pastor of St. Philomena Parish, his first assignment, and rector of its Redemptorist community. He was only 32 years old at the time. Now, there were some in the order resented this. They resented his youth, since he was younger than some of the clergy that were now placed under his authority, that may have had, in some cases, decades more experience than him. But Seelos continued to be beloved by the faithful for his simplicity, his kindness, and his approachability. The following year, Seelos became a U.S. citizen on the 6th of April, 1852. Earlier in the same year, February 5th of 1852, the Holy See appointed Seelos' first pastor and his spiritual father, John Newman, as the 4th Bishop of Philadelphia. His predecessor in that office, Francis Kenrick, was transferred to become Archbishop of Baltimore. But before he left, Kenrick is the one who ordained Newman as a bishop on March 28th. The ordination was held in St. Alphonsus Church, the Redemptorist Church in Baltimore. During Newman's administration as Bishop of Philadelphia, new parish churches were completed at the rate of nearly one per month. He created a Catholic bank in 1853. He was the first bishop in the United States to organize a diocesan system of parish-based schools, the parochial school system. As Catholic parents feared Protestant influence and Protestant discrimination if they sent their children to public schools. Under Newman's administration, the number of parochial schools in his diocese increased from 1 to 200 in only 8 years. Now, that's not 100 to 200. It increased from 1 to 200 in 8 years. Like his spiritual son, Seelos, Newman was not destined for a long life at the punishing pace of work he imposed on himself. On Thursday, January 5th, 1860, Newman dropped dead of a heart attack while walking on a street in Philadelphia. He was running errands. He was aged 48. Newman was declared venerable by Pope Benedict XV in 1921. He was beatified by Pope Paul VI during the Second Vatican Council on October 13th, 1963. And he was canonized by that same Pope, Paul VI, on June 19th, 1977. As we said, so far the only male American citizen to be canonized. Now, you may be thinking, of all the Franciscan martyrs and the Jesuit martyrs that we celebrate, but that was in the colonial period. So some of those guys died within the boundaries of what are now the United States. Like Franciscans in Florida, in Texas, and Kansas, Jesuits in upstate New York, and Jesuits in Virginia, as a matter of fact, too. But they were not American citizens because there was not, obviously the country didn't exist then. So he's the first citizen of the United States who's a man to be canonized. His feast day is January 5th. Meanwhile, in 1853, the year after Newman became a bishop, the Redemptorist novitiate was transferred from Baltimore to Annapolis, still in Maryland. They did this because the heirs of Charles Carroll of Carrollton. Charles Carroll was the only Catholic to sign the Declaration of Independence. Of course, he was deceased by this point, but his fourth generation heirs bequeathed part of his estate to the Redemptorists to use, and so that's why they transferred there. The following year, on January 30th, 1854, Seelos was transferred from Pennsylvania to Maryland to be pastor of St. Alphonsus Church in Baltimore, and simultaneously to serve as rector of its Redemptorist community. St. Alphonsus was quite the sprawling operation at the time. It included 2 parish centers for 2 different language groups. It included another 2 smaller parish, it was missions. They say parish, but places he had to go say Mass, in other words, just on the outskirts of the city, as well as 4 mission stations in rural Maryland. In addition, St. Alphonsus had 1,300 students enrolled in the school, plus had a separate ministry to 500 black Catholic families who lived in the area. Seelos embraced the active apostolate, as did his mentor, Newman, though after 3 years, it wore down his health. On March 7th, 1857, when Seelos was coming out of the confessional in the evening, he stretched his arms and legs, just to before walking back to the rectory, and then blood started spewing out of his mouth from a hemorrhage that left him hospitalized for 4 weeks. He was 38 years old. Seelos later wrote to his sister, one of them who had entered religious life and took in religion the name Sister Damiana. He wrote to her, quote, "You can see from this how fortunate I feel in this sickness, and how I truly consider it as one of the greatest gifts of grace from the Lord." Why? Because he did not have to select a penance for Lent, because the Lord had chosen that for him. A hemorrhage, a near-fatal hemorrhage, was his Lenten penance. After his release from the hospital, Seelos was transferred to become pastor of St. Mary's Parish in Annapolis, Maryland, on April 12th, 1857. Curiously, this appointment lasted only 1 month. On May 19th, 1857, he was transferred again, this time to Cumberland, Maryland, to become the superior and prefect of students at the Redemptorist Seminary. He was replacing, as prefect, Father Michael Mueller, whose abrasive disposition was considered responsible for driving away many vocations from the Redemptorist. Seelos did very well in his new duties, but Father Mueller became his personal enemy. Even though Seelos had in no way sought this new position. I mean, he had just been in a different assignment for 1 month. It never even occurred to him that he was going to get any other assignment this soon, let alone replacing him. But people, sin exists. Sin exists. And so, here this Mueller, who treated the students like dirt, one after another. He was very abrasive, is a polite way to describe it. I mean, abusive is probably, I know that word is used differently today, but I don't mean that kind of abuse. I mean, he's just the kind of, when you're a teacher or training or doing any, there's different kinds of being hard on, there's the kind of hard, tough, that can help your students grow. But then there's another type that just beats them down, and so they lose their spirit. They figure, well, okay, I'm never going to satisfy this guy, so why bother trying? He was the latter. But of course, he's not going to blame himself for that. So it was Seelos' fault. The guy who replaced him blamed him, so focused that hatred on Seelos. Well, sin exists, Anyway, 3 years later, in 1860, the Most Reverend Michael O'Connor, Bishop of Pittsburgh, abdicated his position to join the Jesuit order. He recommended Seelos as the priest most qualified to succeed him, because he knew the area, he was multilingual, and he had a good reputation among the people. Seelos was horrified when he heard about this, so he wrote to Pope Pius IX, explaining his inadequacy to accept this position, begging to be liberated from this calamity, was the way he phrased it. And he was overjoyed when another priest was chosen as Bishop of Pittsburgh. Seelos was still assigned in the same place in Cumberland, Maryland, when his country of adoption tore itself apart in the Civil War. To put some numbers to all of this, according to the census of 1860, the last to take place prior to the American Civil War, the United States had a total population of 31.4 million. Of that, the black population was 4.4 million. Of those 4.4 million, 3.9 million were slaves. 26% of the families in the United States were slave owners. So essentially a fourth of the household, not a fourth of the people, but a fourth of the households owned slaves, and 3/4 of the households did not own slaves. The first 7 out of what would become 11 southern states united to form the Confederate States of America on February 4th, 1861, with the first capital at Montgomery, Alabama. The last capital would end up being in Richmond, Virginia. They elected as their first and only president a Mississippi Senator, Jefferson Davis. At that point, Lincoln called for the formation of an army of 75,000 formed from state militias to recapture a federal base in South Carolina at Fort Sumter. When he issued this call, rather than other states had to decide that they were going to contribute troops or not, rather than take up arms against fellow Southern states, 4 more seceded and joined the Confederacy. Therefore, the adversaries consisted of 11 Confederate states against 23 states of the Federal Union. Though in the course of the war, 2 more states would join the Union, West Virginia and Nevada. So it ended up being 11 states against 25. There were 4 states in which slavery was practiced that did not join the Confederacy. Essentially, they remained neutral, but de facto that means that they were on the federal side and that they did not oppose the movement of federal troops through their state. These 4 slave states that did not join the Confederacy were Missouri, Maryland, Kentucky, and Delaware. And so, 85 years after the Declaration of Independence was signed in 1776, the Union of States that formed the American Republic came to an end in a bloodbath, and that's not hyperbole, that lasted from April 12th, 1861, until April 9th, 1865. Now, that April 9th is when Lee surrendered, Robert E. Lee surrendered, but there were other units that surrendered after, so some might place the end of the Civil War in the following month in May, because there were several others that surrendered. But anyway, April to April, April of 61 to April of 65 is easy to remember. During the war, on September 17th, 1862, the Battle of Antietam was fought near Sharpsburg, Maryland, at the end of which the Confederate forces withdrew. This retreat convinced the British and French to remain neutral. The Confederacy had been courting them as allies. After Sharpsburg, they decided to remain neutral, as they questioned the viability of the Confederate States. This Confederate retreat after Antietam also encouraged President Lincoln to issue the first Emancipation Proclamation. Yes, there were 2 of them. The first was on the 22nd of September, 1862, only 5 days after the Battle of Antietam. The Emancipation Proclamation was an executive order invoking his power under Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution as Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy. This first executive order gave the Confederate States 3 months to return to the Union, essentially offering amnesty if they would return. So it gave them 3 months. Lincoln proclaimed the slaves in any states that remained in the Confederacy after that date to be free. Though, of course, enforcement, that would depend. It would have to wait until federal troops got in there in the states. So time passed, the 3 months passed, and the second Emancipation Proclamation was issued on January 1st, 1863, and it named the Confederate States in which the slaves were freed. Slaves in neutral states, Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, and Delaware, were not freed by these proclamations. Anyway, there's a lot with the Emancipation. There's a whole book on that by a guy named John Franklin, and it's just titled The Emancipation Proclamation. During the war, Mother Henriette DeLille died in New Orleans. She died on November 16th, 1862, 7 months after the recapture of New Orleans by the Union. And we talked about her in the second video. In the same year, 1862, the Redemptorists moved their seminary and novitiate from Cumberland, Maryland to Annapolis, Maryland, and assigned Seelos back there as pastor of St. Mary's Parish and rector of the community house and prefect of students. However, on August 30th of the same year, Seelos was removed from that third job, prefect of students, as a result of slander, sent to the upper echelons of the order in Europe by Father Michael Mueller. as revenge for the imagined offense of having replaced him 5 years earlier in 1857. Imagine that stuck in his craw for 5 years. The calumny, well, this is all, I should say these terms. So slander, there are two types. Morally, I mean, I'm not a lawyer, so but morally, there's two types. So there's detraction, which is spreading around something, bad information about someone that's true, but there's no reason to spread it around. Calumny is the second type. Calumny is spreading around false information that's bad. I mean, just made up. And so that's what this was. So the calumny that Mueller wrote was, quote, "The only thing I have against Father Seelos is that he has not the judgment. He has not the wisdom. He has not the reflection, nor the manner, nor the method to direct the students in the spirit of the congregation of Alphonsus." So revenge was had, but Seelos did remain pastor of St. Mary's and rector of the community. The following year, on March 19, 1863, the ghoulish carnage of the many battles of the war prompted the Union President, Abraham Lincoln, to push through Congress a conscription law, drafting into military service only men, aged 20 to 45. Yet it contained a provision that service in uniform, could be avoided by simply paying a fee. This manifest injustice to the poor led to the first draft riot in New York City the same year. As rector of the Redemptorist House closest to the Capitol, it fell to Seelos to travel to Washington, D.C. and meet with Lincoln regarding drafting the seminarians and the younger priest from the congregation. To his own surprise, Seelos obtained an exemption from Lincoln. So, in other words, that the seminarians like the Redemptorists would not be drafted. Seelos did not record the details of the interaction, but only wrote to his sister, quote, "And the storm passed over, thanks to God and the intercession of Mary." 6 months later, on September 22nd, 1863, Seelos was appointed superior of a parish mission band. Not musical band, although he could do that. He was a musician. I mean, like the circuit mission group. They traveled across 10 states during the next 2 years. And it proved to be a spectacular success, with so many families bereaved at the loss of loved ones in the fighting, or worried for those who were still enlisted. So many were in desperate need of exactly what they were offering, a spiritual solace. He preached in English and German in Connecticut, Illinois, Michigan, Missouri, New Jersey, New York, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, and Wisconsin. During this mission, the Civil War finally came to an end. As we said, Lee surrendered on April 9th. The last Confederate army surrendered on May 26th, 1865. That was the following month. And that unit was General Kirby Smith, who controlled northern Louisiana and East Texas. He personally did not surrender like Lee did. He sent a deputy to do it, but he did surrender. It was the last Confederate land unit to surrender. The human cost of the Civil War is nearly incomprehensible. 623,000 were killed in the fighting. An additional 471,000 were wounded. And of those wounded, 50,000 were amputees. Of those who fought, 186,000 were African Americans enlisted in the Union Army. And of those, 38,000 lost their lives. 7 months later, on December 18th, 1865, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution transformed the Emancipation Proclamations into constitutional law for the Republic, reading as follows: "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for a crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction." Seelos' 2-year mission ended in April of 65, 1 month before the same month that Lee surrendered. 4 months later, in August of 65, Seelos was assigned to St. Mary's Parish in Detroit, Michigan. This time, he was only parochial vicar. He was not pastor or rector. His pastor, Father Francis Van Emstead, wrote of him, quote, "Father Seelos did everything willingly and cheerfully, that at all times he showed such a childlike and pious joy. He knew how to entertain everyone in his presence in a kindly way. His look was piety, his glance was comfort, and benevolence played around his venerable aspect." The following year, September 28th, 1866, Seelos was transferred to St. Mary of the Assumption, right here in New Orleans. He was granted the infused grace of knowledge to know the time and the manner of his death. He confided this to a sister of Notre Dame who was on the same train bringing him south to New Orleans. She asked him how long he was going to stay in the city. He replied, "For a year, and then I will die of the yellow fever," which is exactly what happened. Arriving at the parish, he commented, "Here I'll rest my bones in the grave, for I think I have wandered enough." Bishop Antoine Blanc invited the Redemptorists to New Orleans in 1843. As a diverse population continued to emigrate, settle near the river for work, 3 churches were constructed within what was locally known as the Redemptorist Parish. Notre Dame de Bon Secours in 1847 was French language. St. Alphonsus, 1857, was English language, but for Irish immigrants. St. Mary's Assumption, 1858, was for German language. The whole compound also had 3 convents of religious sisters, 2 orphanages, and 5 schools. Seelos ministered in New Orleans for only a year, at which point the mosquito re-enters our story. The yellow fever erupted, with the first deaths recorded in the city on September 3rd, 1867. By the time it was done, 3,107 in New Orleans were dead in 2 months. Therefore, it did not have the lethality of the 1853 outbreak covered in the last video, which killed 8,000 in one summer. But this one had a broader impact in the region, claiming 20,000 across the South, including in Texas. The wife of Sam Houston died of this yellow fever. In the Redemptorist Parish, 11 priests and brothers contracted the disease, including Seelos. Of those 11, 4 died. With regard to Seelos, Father Benedict Neihart recorded that Seelos became ill on September 17, 1867. His description is as follows, quote, "On the 17th of September, while the community was at table, it was noticed that Father Seelos looked unusually depressed and pale. All perceived the clearest marks of the yellow fever about his eyes." That must mean the jaundice, the whites of the eyes turning yellow. Seelos appeared to recover for a time, as we saw in the first video, that sometimes is part of yellow fever. They seem to get better, but then they get worse. And that's what happened here. Seelos, 9 days later, he was still severely weak, exhausted, and listless. Then we pick up with the quote again. Our dear dying father remained conscious to his last breath. His lips continually moved in prayer. His eyes were fixed on the crucifix until they could see no more. A supernatural brightness appeared to illuminate his dying countenance. His joy at the moment of dissolution approached, communicated itself to all present. Seelos died on October 4th, 1867, at the age of 48 years and 9 months. In terms of years, age 48, that was the same year, the same age as his spiritual father, Newman, also died at age 48. It was remembered by one of the brothers in the community, Brother Lewis, that Brother Lewis, asked Seelos while he was dying to tell him how to please God. Seelos responded, quote, "I think the best way is to accept the will of God, to obey faithfully and quietly the orders of one's superior, and to do the work assigned to you. It is not necessary to accomplish extraordinary deeds." Seelos was beatified by Pope John Paul II on April 9th in the millennium year 2000. The Pope stated, quote, "Today, Blessed Francis Xavier Seelos invites the members of the Church to deepen their union with Christ in the sacraments of penance and the Eucharist. Through his intercession, may all who work in the vineyard for the salvation of God's people be encouraged and strengthened in their task." As a coda to this three-part series in which yellow fever has figured so prominently, especially in the first two, it is right and proper to remember that the last Archbishop of New Orleans to die of the yellow fever was a French immigrant. He was the 6th Archbishop of New Orleans, Placide Louis Chapelle. Born on August 28, 1842, 3 months before Seelos was accepted as a Redemptorist novice. Chapelle attended minor seminary in France, then traveled to the United States and entered major seminary at St. Mary's in Baltimore, Maryland, which is the proto-seminary in the United States. There he earned a doctorate in theology and was noted for his facility with languages. He was ordained a priest on June 28, 1865. 2 months after, Seelos completed his 2-year, 10-state parish mission assignment. Chapelle was stationed as pastor of St. John's Church in Rockville, Maryland, and 4 years later was transferred to be pastor of St. Joseph's in Baltimore. In 1882, he was appointed to St. Matthew's in Washington, which later became the cathedral, when Washington was carved out of Baltimore as a separate diocese. Chapelle became Archbishop of Santa Fe, New Mexico, on January 7, 1894. 3 years later, he was transferred here, became Archbishop of New Orleans on December 7, 1897. While retaining this position, Archbishop of New Orleans, on October 11, 1898, the Holy See simultaneously appointed Chapelle Apostolic Delegate to Cuba, Apostolic Delegate to Puerto Rico, and Envoy Extraordinaire to the Philippine Islands. Why? Well, the connection being the Spanish-American War, same year, 1898, in the course of which the United States, I suppose acquired is probably the polite way to phrase it. The United States acquired those 3 places, those former Spanish, they were part of the Spanish Empire, and we won the Spanish-American War, so then we acquired those territories. And why Chapelle? Well, he was fluent in Spanish as well as French and English. Coincidentally, in the fulfillment of those duties, Chapelle had to travel back and forth between New Orleans, Cuba, Puerto Rico, Philippines. He happened to be in Havana, Cuba, in 1905, when he learned of a yellow fever outbreak in his cathedral city of New Orleans. Instead of remaining in Cuba until it passed, he immediately got on a ship and went back to New Orleans. He landed on May 30th, 1905. And he started bringing the last rites to the dying, right alongside all of his other priests. 3 months later, Chappelle contracted the same disease. He died of yellow fever on August 9th, 1905. The reason 1905 was the final outbreak of yellow fever in New Orleans was because of another development that took place, coincidentally, on the island of Cuba, overlapping with Chappelle's appointment to serve that former Spanish colony. Carlos Juan Finley was a Cuban epidemiologist. He served as the chief public health officer of Cuba from 1902 to 1909. He was the first to theorize that yellow fever was not caused by foul air, but instead was caused by a mosquito bite. During years of experimentation, he isolated the species of mosquito, Aedes aegypti. This led to preventative measures. Once they knew what it was the mosquito, then they looked for the stagnant pools of water where the eggs bred, and so they started covering over water cisterns. And this, in addition to preventative measures, led to, once they knew what they were looking for, Walter Reed, for whom Walter Reed Hospital is named, he developed a vaccine in 1903. It took time to be widely available, and so 1905 was the last yellow fever outbreak in New Orleans. And now today, certainly in New Orleans, I'm sure in other southern cities too, you'll hear the mosquito trucks periodically spraying various insecticides to slaughter as many mosquitoes as possible. And may they all be slaughtered until they go extinct. All 3,200 species of them. I mean, really, do we need the mosquito? What is in there? Okay. Anyway, on that note, this concludes our 3-part series on the church and priesthood in times of crisis, specifically focusing on examples of pestilence, seeking lessons for this COVID pandemic. And the central lesson, I think, is clear from all three, is that for priests in the church, when in these times of crisis, what they did is focus on the corporal works of mercy. How it goes down to that. And what are they? Well, we know. Jesus said, Matthew 25, when did you see me hungry, feed, thirsty, give me drink? You know, and that, so that's what it all comes down to, is the priest giving the sacraments and the corporal works of mercy. If you are able to assist us at St. Louis, King of France, financially at this time, you can do so online by clicking the Support St. Louis link below this video. Or if you prefer to use the Postal Service to mail in donations, the address is also below this video. Thank you to all of you who have been supporting us, especially during the COVID enclosure. And for those of you who cannot assist financially at this time, please continue to give us your spiritual support through prayer. Blessed Seelos would have been the first to say, that matters. And so we'll conclude with a prayer. Almighty God, we ask that you grant us the wisdom to discern what is right, the will to choose it, and the strength to make it endure. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. Blessed Francis Xavier Seelos, pray for us. Our Lady of Prompt Succor, hasten to help us. In conclusion, stay cautious, stay calm, stay safe. Thank you for your attention. This session is adjourned.